40 seconds, the woman whispered. Her voice was not a shout, yet it cut through the heavy, panting silence of the training pit like a serrated blade. That is how long it takes for a lack of oxygen to turn panic into unconsciousness. Miller was on his knees, gasping, clutching his throat. The arrogance that had fueled him moments ago was now puddling in the dust beneath his boots. Around him, 3 other recruits lay scattered in groaning heaps, one nursing a dislocated shoulder, the other 2 struggling to find their equilibrium after a center of gravity takedown that their eyes had failed to track. "You called this a sparring match," the woman continued, stepping closer. The harsh California sun beat down on her, but she did not sweat. She moved with the predatory grace of something that lived in the deep dark. She crouched down, bringing her face level with Miller's terrified eyes. "But in the field, Recruit Miller, there is no sparring. There is only the living and the dead." She reached out, her hand hovering over his collar. Miller flinched, expecting another strike. Instead, she adjusted her own collar, which had been askew from the scuffle. As the fabric shifted, the sunlight caught the dull, oxidized metal pinned to her undershirt, a golden eagle clutching a trident and pistol. Miller stopped breathing. The air in the pit smelled of iron, dust, and sudden, absolute regret. "Stand up," she ordered, her voice devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "Class is in session." 48 hours earlier, Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The heat at the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight. It pressed down on the asphalt of the grinder, distorting the air above the concrete and turning the distant outline of the Pacific Ocean into a shimmering mirage. Elena Vance adjusted the collar of her beige utility uniform, feeling the familiar trickle of sweat trace the line of her spine. She stood in the shadow of the Logistics Support Unit warehouse, a clipboard in one hand and a scanner in the other. To the casual observer, she was just another cog in the massive machine of the Navy, a logistics officer checking inventory, perhaps a bit too small for the uniform, her dark hair pulled back into a severe regulation bun. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were the color of flint, scanning the perimeter not just for crates and serial numbers, but for movement, for threats, for the subtle shifts in the environment that most people ignored. It was a habit born of 15 years in places that did not exist on tourist maps, places where a moment of distraction meant a flag-draped coffin. "Inventory check, Section 4 Alpha complete," she murmured to herself, marking the sheet. Her voice was raspy, the lingering effect of smoke inhalation from an extraction gone wrong in the Pech Valley 6 months ago. That mission had given her a torn rotator cuff and a reassignment to this administrative purgatory while she healed. The rhythmic thud of combat boots interrupted her focus. A platoon of Bud SS candidates came jogging past, their faces glistening with sweat and sand. They were young, painfully young. Their bodies were sculpted by endless hours of calisthenics, fueled by testosterone and the arrogance of men who believed they were immortal. "Pick it up, ladies! My grandmother runs faster than this!" A harsh voice bellowed from the front. Elena didn't look up, but she knew the voice. Recruit Caleb Miller, class leader for Class 356. A former collegiate wrestler, built like a tank and possessing an ego to match. He was the kind of soldier who mistook volume for leadership and aggression for competence. As the group slowed to a walk near the water station by her warehouse, Miller's gaze drifted toward her. He wiped his face with a sandy forearm and nudged the recruit next to him. "Hey, check it out," Miller said, loud enough for his voice to carry, Logistics is working hard today. Counting boxes must be exhausting. A ripple of laughter went through the small group of 4 men who had lagged behind with him. They were the elite of the class, the ones who consistently clocked the best times and lifted the heaviest logs. They felt untouchable. Elena paused, the tip of her pen hovering over the paper. She didn't turn her head. She simply waited. "Maybe we should ask her for some extra Gatorade," another recruit snickered. "She looks like she controls the good stuff." "Careful," Miller mocked, stepping closer to the imaginary boundary of her workspace. "She might hit you with her clipboard. I hear paper cuts are lethal in the rear echelon." Elena slowly lowered the clipboard. She turned, her movements deliberate and devoid of wasted energy. She looked at Miller, really looked at him, dissecting his posture, his breathing, the way he shifted his weight to his left leg. He was strong, yes, but he was unbalanced. "Recruit Miller," Elena said. Her tone was flat, lacking the screaming intensity of the instructors he was used to. It was the quiet tone of a parent addressing a misbehaving child, or perhaps a predator observing prey. "You are 3 minutes behind the main formation. I suggest you catch up before Instructor Martinez decides you need a wet and sandy session." Miller's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, annoyed by her lack of intimidation. He puffed out his chest, towering over her 5'7" frame. "We run on our own time, ma'am," he said, emphasizing the rank with a dripping sarcasm. "We're the tip of the spear. We don't worry about clocks." "The spear has a handle, recruit," Elena replied, turning back to her inventory. "Without the handle, the tip is just a useless piece of metal lying in the dirt. Move along." Miller's face flushed. To be dismissed so casually by a logistics clerk was an insult his pride couldn't process. He took a step forward, invading her personal space, his shadow falling over her clipboard. "You know," he whispered, leaning down, "you support personnel should show a little more respect to the men who are actually going to do the fighting." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just kept writing, the scratching of her pen the only sound between them. "Run along, Miller," she said softly, "before you trip over your own ego." Miller stared at the back of her head, his fists clenching at his sides. He wasn't done with her, not by a long shot. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, but it offered no relief. The concrete of the naval amphibious base retained the day's heat, radiating it back upward into the cooling twilight air. The atmosphere in the chow line was thick, a pungent cocktail of stale sweat, wet sand, and the aggressive hunger of 200 men who had spent the last 12 hours pushing their bodies beyond the point of failure. Elena stood behind a long, folding table stacked high with brown plastic cases. Inside were the MREs, meals ready to eat, that would serve as dinner for the candidates tonight. The galley was closed for maintenance, a logistical hiccup that had landed this mundane duty in her lap. She did not mind. There was a meditative quality to the rhythm of distribution. Grab a packet, hand it over, mark the roster. "Name," she said, her voice cutting through the low murmur of exhausted chatter. "Simmons, Class 356, a weary recruit croaked, extending a trembling hand. Elena slid a package across the table without looking at the label. "Menu 4, pork sausage with gravy. Move out." Simmons nodded gratefully, too tired to care about the contents, and shuffled away into the darkness to consume his 3,000 calories. Elena watched him go, noting the limp in his gait. Shin splints. He would be icing them tonight if he was smart. or hiding the pain if he was foolish. The line moved steadily until a shadow fell across the table that felt heavier than the others. Elena did not need to look up to know who it was, but she did anyway. Caleb Miller stood there, his chest heaving slightly, his uniform stained dark with perspiration and seawater. Behind him, 3 other recruits, his loyal phalanx, hovered with smirks that seemed out of place on such tired faces. "Miller," Elena said, reaching for the next packet on the stack. She placed it on the table. It was Menu 11, vegetable crumbles with pasta. In the unspoken hierarchy of MREs, it was widely considered one of the least desirable options, a bad draw in the lottery of field rations. Miller looked at the packet, then back at Elena. He did not pick it up. "I need a trade," Miller said. His voice was not a request. It was a demand wrapped in thin politeness. "I put out hard today. I need protein. Give me the chili mac. Menu 10. Elena's hand remained on the vegetable crumbles. "You get what you get, recruit. That is the standard. Take it and move." "Standard?" Miller let out a sough, short, sharp laugh. He leaned in, placing his hands on the table. His knuckles were raw from the obstacle course. "Look, lady, I don't know how things work in your air-conditioned office, but out here, we burn fuel. I'm leading this class. I need real food, not this vegetarian garbage." The line behind them stalled. Silence rippled outward from the table as other recruits stopped to watch. This was a direct challenge to authority, albeit a minor one. Elena felt a familiar calmness settle over her. It was the same detachment she felt when looking through a scope, factoring in windage and elevation. She looked at Miller, really seeing him. She saw the desperation for control in his eyes. He was used to bending the world to his will with physical dominance. Being denied a specific meal packet was not about the food. It was about the word no. "Your body will process the carbohydrates and protein in this packet, just as it would any other," Elena said, her voice low and even. "In the field, you eat cold beans out of a tin while taking fire, and you are grateful for it. You do not negotiate with logistics because you think you are special." Miller's face darkened. The exhaustion was stripping away his filter. "We are special. We are the ones doing the dying. You? You are just the help. You sit behind a desk and count beans while we bleed. So just hand me the damn chili mac." The insult hung in the air, heavy and ugly. The recruits behind Miller shifted uncomfortably. Insulting a Master Chief, even if they didn't know she was one, was dangerous ground. But to them, she was just an E4 or E5 supply clerk, an obstacle to be bulldozed. Elena picked up the vegetable crumbles. For a second, Miller thought she was taking it back to swap it. Instead, she held it out, pressing it firmly against his chest, forcing him to take it or let it fall. "Hunger is a weapon, Miller," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him blink. "It teaches discipline. Tonight, you learn." She released the packet. Miller caught it reflexively against his chest. "Next!" Elena called out, looking past him to the recruit behind. Miller stood there for a moment, stunned by the absolute dismissal. He gripped the plastic package so hard, the edges crinkled loudly. His jaw worked as he chewed on a retort that wouldn't come. He had expected her to get flustered, to cite regulations nervously, or to yield to avoid a scene. He had not expected to be looked at as if he were a minor inconvenience. "Let's go, Caleb," one of his friends muttered, pulling at his sleeve. "It's not worth it." Miller turned slowly, his eyes burning with humiliation. He glared at Elena, who was already handing a beef ravioli to the next man, completely ignoring his existence. "Watch your back, logistics," Miller hissed under his breath, loud enough only for her to hear. Elena did not pause. She did not watch him walk away. She knew exactly where he was going. He was going to a place of resentment, a place she had seen many men go before they either broke or became monsters. She just hoped that when the time came to break him, she could put the pieces back together correctly. The obstacle course at Coronado was an architecture of misery designed to break the human spirit. From her vantage point on the second floor of the logistics warehouse, Elena watched through the dusty blinds of a window that faced the training grounds. She held a pair of Steiner binoculars, the optics steady in her hands despite the dull ache in her left shoulder. To anyone passing by the office door, she was merely taking a break. In reality, she was conducting reconnaissance. Below, Class 356 was engaging with the Weaver, a brutal series of inverted wooden beams that required a candidate to weave their body over and under each log without touching the ground. It was a test of rhythm, core strength, and flexibility. Through the magnified lenses, Elena found Caleb Miller. He was impossible to miss. While other candidates struggled, their muscles trembling as they hooked their legs around the rough timber, Miller moved with the explosive power of a freight train. He didn't finesse the obstacle. He attacked it. He hauled his heavy frame over the beams with brute upper body strength, bypassing technique in favor of raw athleticism. "Fast," Elena murmured to the empty room. "But noisy." She shifted her focus slightly to the left. Miller's swim buddy, a smaller recruit named Davis, was floundering. Davis had slipped on the second beam, his grip failing on the sweat-slicked wood. He was hanging by one arm, his legs kicking uselessly as he tried to regain purchase. In the SEAL teams, the swim buddy system was sacred. You moved as a unit. You succeeded together, or you failed together. There was no individual glory. Elena watched Miller reach the end of the Weaver. He dropped to the sand, his chest heaving. He turned and looked back. The moment stretched. Through the binoculars, Elena saw Miller's eyes lock onto Davis, who was gritting his teeth, veins bulging in his neck as he fought gravity. The instructor's whistle was already in his mouth, ready to signal a failure. This was the test. Not the wood, not the sand, but the choice. Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he turned his back. He did not shout encouragement. He did not wait to ensure his partner made it. He pivoted and sprinted toward the finish line, intent on securing the course record. Elena lowered the binoculars slowly. The disappointment tasted like ash in her mouth. It was a familiar flavor. She had seen men like Miller before, gifted warriors who believed the mission was about them. She had also seen what happened to those men in the Hindu Kush Mountains and the valleys of Somalia. They died alone, or worse. They got good men killed because they were too busy chasing a medal to check their six. A memory flashed unbidden, a hand reaching out to her in the darkness of a collapsed building in Syria. Not to pull himself up, but to push her toward the extraction point. That was strength. What Miller had was just vanity wrapped in muscle. Below, the whistle shrieked. Davis had fallen. The instructors descended on him like sharks, filling the air with shouts of, "Drop on down!" and demands for push-ups. Miller was standing at the finish line, hands on his hips, checking his watch, oblivious to the fact that half his team had just been decimated. Elena picked up a small black notebook from the desk. She clicked her pen and wrote a single entry under the date. Candidate, Miller, C. Assessment: high kinetic potential, 0 tactical empathy. Status: liability. She closed the book with a snap. The physical gap between the logistics clerk and the elite recruit was only a few hundred yards of asphalt, but the moral chasm was widening by the hour. He thought he was winning. He had no idea he had just failed the only test that mattered to her. The armory was a sanctuary of steel and oil, a sharp contrast to the chaotic noise of the training grounds outside. Here the air was cool and heavy with the scent of CLP, the distinct solvent-heavy perfume of cleaner, lubricant, and preservative that every soldier knew by heart. For Elena, it was the smell of home. She sat at a workbench illuminated by a single, focused halogen lamp. Spread out before her on a neoprene mat were the disassembled components of a Sig Sauer P-26. The Navy was transitioning to Glocks in many units, but the P-226 remained a workhorse for training at Coronado, a heavy, hammer-fired pistol that demanded respect and rigorous maintenance. Elena picked up the slide of weapon number 492. During the initial function check, the action had felt gritty. A fraction of a millimeter of friction could mean a failure to feed during a live-fire exercise. In combat, that friction was the difference between a suppressed target and a posthumous Medal of Honor. In training, it was merely dangerous. She closed her eyes. Sight could be deceiving, distracted by scratches or finish wear that didn't matter. Touch never lied. Elena ran her fingertips along the slide rails, feeling for the imperfection that had caused the drag. She moved slowly, her hands exploring the machined steel with the delicacy of a surgeon. She found it, a microscopic burr of metal on the inner track, likely caused by a recruit forcing the slide during reassembly. "Hey, look at that." The voice broke her concentration, but she did not open her eyes. She knew the timbre. It was Miller again, his voice echoing from the corridor that ran past the wire mesh cage of the armory. Elena kept her fingers on the metal burr, gauging its depth. "Logistics is playing soldier," another voice chimed in. "I think she's trying to figure out how to put the puzzle back together." Through the wire mesh, Miller and 3 of his cohorts paused. They were hauling crates of gear to the staging area, but they always found time for mockery. To them, the sight was pathetic. A small woman sitting in the dark, eyes closed, holding gun parts as if praying for guidance. They saw hesitation where there was actually hyper-focused competence. "Don't hurt yourself, sweetheart," Miller called out, his tone dripping with faux concern. "The spring can snap back if you don't know what you're doing. Maybe you should leave the weapons to the men who actually shoot them." Elena felt a muscle in her jaw tighten. The temptation to snap the slide back onto the frame, rack it, and dry fire in their direction in under a second was potent. It would terrify them. It would silence them. But it would also blow her cover. A logistics clerk didn't handle a weapon like a Tier 1 operator. A logistics clerk fumbled, so she did nothing. She sat motionless, letting their laughter wash over her like dirty water. "Come on," Miller said, losing interest. "Let's go. I don't want to be around when she accidentally shoots her foot off." Their footsteps faded down the hallway, accompanied by the receding sound of their self-assured chuckles. Only when the silence returned completely did Elena open her eyes. The gray flint of her irises seemed to catch the halogen light. She reached for a fine grit diamond file from her toolkit. With 2 precise strokes, she removed the metal burr. She wiped the surface clean with a rag soaked in oil. Then her hands moved. It was a blur of motion too fast for the casual eye to track. The barrel dropped into the slide. The recoil spring and guide rods snapped into place. The slide aligned with the frame rails and racked back with a satisfying metallic clack. She performed a function check. Trigger squeeze, hold, rack, release. The reset was crisp, audible, and perfect. The grit was gone. Elena placed the fully assembled pistol back on the rack, aligning it perfectly with the others. "You have no idea," she whispered to the empty room, "what kind of fire you are playing with." The weapon was ready for war. The boys outside, however, were still playing games. The officers' wardroom at Coronado was a study in controlled stratification. Unlike the chaotic energy of the enlisted mess hall, this space was quieter, cooler, and governed by an unspoken set of social rules that were as rigid as the uniform code of military justice. The air smelled of industrial coffee and the faint, sterile scent of floor wax. Elena sat alone at a small table near the window, her back to the wall, a habit she had never been able to break, even in the safest environments on Earth. On her tray sat a portion of lukewarm mashed potatoes and a dry chicken breast, food she consumed with mechanical efficiency rather than enjoyment. 2 tables away, a group of buds instructors were eating. They were loud, their laughter confident and exclusionary, born of shared suffering and the brotherhood of the trident. Elena kept her eyes on her plate, but her ears were tuned to their frequency. "I'm telling you, she's a robot," said a lieutenant commander, a man with a thick neck and a sunburned nose. "I went down to logistics to get extra chem lights for the night op. She cited the requisition form code at me. Didn't even look up." "The new logistics lady?" another officer asked, chuckling. "Vance?" "Yeah, Vance. A total bean counter. Zero flexibility. It's like she thinks those forms are going to win the war." Elena sliced a piece of chicken. The term bean counter was a common slur for support personnel, a way for the combat arms officers to separate the warriors from the workers. Once, years ago, she might have felt the urge to slam her own trident onto the table, the one currently locked in a small velvet box in her quarters, and silence them. Now she felt only a mild, distant amusement. Let them think she was a bureaucrat. A bureaucrat was invisible. A bureaucrat was safe. "She's just doing her job, sir," a younger voice interjected. Elena paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She glanced up through her lashes. It was Lieutenant Evans, a junior officer who had processed her transfer paperwork. He had seen the redacted lines in her service record. He knew she hadn't come from a supply depot in Virginia. She had come from a Tier 1 medical facility. The lieutenant commander frowned at Evans. "You defending the help, Evans?" Evans opened his mouth to speak, his eyes darting toward Elena. He looked ready to drop a hint, to tell them that the bean counter likely had more confirmed kills than everyone at their table combined. Elena caught his gaze. She didn't shake her head. She didn't wave. She simply narrowed her eyes slightly, a microscopic tightening of the facial muscles that communicated a clear, imperative order. "Stand down." Evans hesitated, swallowed hard, and looked back at his plate. "No, sir. Just saying. Regulations are regulations." "Damn right," the commander grunted, satisfied. "But she doesn't have to be such a ghost about it." Elena returned to her meal, the crisis averted. The anonymity was a warm blanket. She preferred the disdain of the ignorant to the hero worship of the informed. The peace, however, was short-lived. The heavy double doors of the wardroom swung open, and a few senior candidates from Class 356 entered to clear trays as part of their mess duty. Leading the detail was Caleb Miller. He spotted her immediately. The layout of the room meant he had to pass near her table to reach the scullery. He slowed his pace, ensuring his voice would carry just enough to be heard by her, but not by the officers dining nearby. "Look at her," Miller muttered to the recruit beside him. "Eating with the big dogs. Think she feels important?" "She looks lonely," the other recruit sneered. Miller paused right behind her chair. Elena could smell the stale sweat on his uniform, a sharp contrast to the clean wardroom. "Hey guys," Miller whispered, his tone dripping with malice. "I think the logistics lady needs a little excitement. She's too stiff. We should help her loosen up on the way to the grinder later." "What do you have in mind?" "Just a little bump," Miller said, a cruel smile audible in his voice. "An accident. Let's see if she cries when she drops her precious paperwork." They moved on, their laughter low and conspiring. Elena took a sip of water. The water was room temperature, tasteless. She placed her napkin on the tray, stood up, and smoothed her uniform. She didn't look at the officers, and she didn't look at the recruits. She walked out of the wardroom with a steady, rhythmic gait. Miller wanted to play games. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see the weak, administrative woman crumble under the pressure of his masculinity. He had no idea that he was poking a sleeping dragon, and the dragon was waking up. The corridor connecting the administrative wing to the exterior training grounds was a tactical nightmare. It was narrow, poorly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes, and flanked by blind corners, a perfect choke point. Elena moved through it with a heavy banker's box braced against her hip. The cardboard container was filled with updated range safety officer manuals, a dense weight of paper that pulled at the recovering muscles in her left shoulder. She walked in the center of the hallway, her boots making no sound on the linoleum. Her mind was already on the task ahead, cataloging the updates, cross-referencing them with the current protocols, and filing them before 1700 hours. It was mundane work, but it kept her hands busy and her mind off the phantom pain that sometimes throbbed where the bullet had grazed her bone months ago. At the far end of the corridor, the sunlight from the open door created a blinding white rectangle. 4 silhouettes stepped into that light, blocking the exit. They moved abreast, filling the width of the hallway, walking with the swagger of men who believed they owned the space they occupied. Elena recognized the formation immediately. It was Miller and his inner circle. They were not moving to let her pass. She adjusted her grip on the box and pulled slightly to the right, aiming to slip past them with minimal interaction. As the gap closed, the recruits adjusted their trajectory. It was subtle, a shift in step, a lean of the shoulder. But to an eye trained to spot micro-expressions and pre-assault indicators, it was as loud as a siren. They were going to hit her. In a combat zone, she would have dropped the box and engaged. She would have shattered the lead target's knee and used his body as a shield against the others. But this was Coronado. These were not insurgents. They were American sailors, however misguided. Elena braced herself. As Miller passed, he didn't just bump her, he checked her. He drove his heavy shoulder into hers with the force of a linebacker, feigning a stumble. "Whoops!" Miller exclaimed. The physics were unavoidable. The impact jarred Elena's injured shoulder. Her grip failed. The box tumbled from her hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. It burst open, sending hundreds of pages of safety manuals sliding across the waxed floor in a chaotic white fan. Time seemed to decelerate. Elena's right hand twitched. Her fingers curled into a half fist, the thumb tucking instinctively to reinforce the knuckles. Her body weight shifted to the balls of her feet. In her mind's eye, she saw the sequence. Throat strike, solar plexus, sweep the leg, It would take less than 2 seconds to put Miller on the floor, gasping for air through a crushed windpipe. "Stand down, Viper," the voice in her head commanded. It was the voice of her old Master Chief, echoing from years past. "Discipline is doing what you don't want to do." She exhaled slowly, forcing her muscles to unlock. She did not strike. She stood still, looking at the mess on the floor. "Oh, man," Miller said, stopping and looking down with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "My bad. Didn't see you there. You're kind of small, you know?" His friends chuckled, the sound bouncing off the narrow walls. They made no move to help. They loomed over her, enjoying the power dynamic. 4 large men standing over a woman surrounded by fallen paper. "Do you need me to call someone?" Miller asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe a real sailor to help you pick that up?" Elena looked up. She didn't look at his uniform or his face. She looked straight into his pupils. Her expression was devoid of annoyance, anger, or fear. It was a flat, terrifying nothingness. It was the look a shark gives a swimmer before it decides whether or not to feed. "No, Recruit Miller," she said. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, yet it silenced the laughter of the other 3 men instantly. "I clean up my own messes." Miller's smile faltered. For a second, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to step back, as if he had just leaned over a railing and realized the drop was deeper than he thought. "Whatever," Miller muttered, breaking eye contact. "Watch where you're going next time." He pushed past her, signaling his group to follow. They walked away, their boots heavy on the floor, but the laughter didn't restart until they were well out into the sunlight. Elena knelt. She began to gather the papers, stacking them neatly, aligning the edges with precise, methodical movements. One page had a boot print on it. Miller's print. She picked it up and stared at the dark smudge of dirt on the white paper. She folded the page carefully and placed it in her pocket instead of the box. The game had changed. They wanted to break her. They didn't know that you couldn't break something that had already been forged in fire. You could only sharpen it. The firing range was finally quiet, save for the incessant whipping of the wind coming off the Pacific. The air tasted metallic, a heavy blend of salt spray and the sharp, burnt sulfur scent of spent gunpowder. Thousands of brass casings glinted in the afternoon sun, scattered across the concrete and gravel like a carpet of fool's gold. Elena stood by the safety line, her clipboard tucked under her arm. The live fire evolution was over. According to the base schedule and the immutable laws of range safety, this was the time for brass call, the mandatory policing of all spent ammunition. It was a tedious task, but a sacred one. It taught recruits that the mission wasn't over until the site was clean. It taught them that a stray casing left on a flight deck could destroy a turbine engine. The majority of Class 356 was already on their hands and knees, forming a line to sweep the area. They moved with the exhaustion of men who had been awake for 20 hours, but they moved. Except for 4 men. Caleb Miller and his entourage stood near the exit gate, their gear bags slung casually over their shoulders. They were drinking water, laughing, and watching their classmates scour the ground. They made no move to join the line. Elena walked toward them. Her boots crunched loudly on the loose gravel, announcing her approach. "Recruit Miller," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "Your squad is not exempt from police call. Get on the line." Miller turned slowly, unscrewing the cap of his canteen. He took a long, deliberate sip before answering, water trickling down his chin. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, eyeing her with a look of bored irritation. "We're done, Chief," Miller said, intentionally using the wrong form of address for a civilian-clad officer, though technically accurate to her hidden rank. "We shot the highest scores. The guys with the misses can clean up the mess. That's how it works, right? Winners rest." "That is not how it works," Elena replied, stopping 5 feet from him. "In this community, no one is too good to sweep the floor. Attention to detail saves lives. Picking up brass is part of the discipline. Now put your bags down." Miller scoffed, exchanging a glance with the recruit next to him, a tall, lanky kid named O'Connor, who looked like he was itching for a fight. "Look," Miller said, stepping forward, invading her space for the second time that day. "We have a conditioning run in 20 minutes. We need to prep. Why don't you get down there and pick them up? You're already looking at the ground anyway." He moved a step around her. It was a direct refusal of a lawful order. In the fleet, this would be grounds for a captain's mast. Here, in the pressure cooker of Bud's, it was a dangerous gamble that Miller felt safe taking against a logistics officer. Elena sidestepped, placing herself directly in his path again. She did not raise her hands. She stood with her arms loose at her sides, her posture relaxed but rooted. "Naval Special Warfare Instruction 3591.1 Delta," Elena recited, her voice monotone and precise. "Section 4, Paragraph 2. All personnel, regardless of rank or performance, shall participate in range remediation immediately following fire. Failure to comply constitutes a safety violation and a dereliction of duty." She looked up at him. "Do you want me to file the dereliction report, Miller? Or do you want to pick up the brass?" Miller stopped. The specific citation of the regulation caught him off guard. He stared at her, his jaw tightening. He realized she wasn't going to back down. She wasn't intimidated by his size, his aggression, or his status as the class leader. She was a wall. A dark, ugly thought crossed Miller's face. He leaned in close, lowering his voice so the other recruits cleaning up couldn't hear. "You like quoting the book, don't you?" Miller whispered. "You think you know what this life is about because you read the manual, but you don't know pain. You don't know what we do." "I know enough," Elena said. "Prove it," Miller hissed. "Training Ground 4, the CQC mats. 10 minutes. No cameras, no officers, just us." He smiled, a predatory expression that bared his teeth. "You come down there, and if you can last 1 minute in the ring with us, just a little sparring, we'll come back and pick up every single piece of brass with our teeth. If you don't show, you file your little report, and we'll know you're a coward." It was a trap. It was primitive, stupid, and fueled by a bruised ego. It was also exactly the opening Elena needed. "Training Ground 4, Elena repeated. 10 minutes. "Don't be late," Miller sneered. He signaled his boys and they pushed past her, heading not toward the barracks, but toward the close-quarters combat shed. Elena watched them go. She reached up and touched the collar of her shirt, feeling the outline of the trident underneath. She didn't feel anger anymore. She felt a cold, professional resolve. They wanted a lesson in pain. She would ensure the curriculum was thorough. Training Ground 4 was a corrugated metal structure situated on the periphery of the base, separated from the main administrative buildings by a stretch of scrub brush and sand. Inside, it was known as the Kill House, a labyrinth of plywood walls, rubber floors, and catwalks designed to simulate the claustrophobic terror of urban warfare. Even when empty, the building held a menacing energy, retaining the echoes of flashbangs and the aggressive shouts of breach teams. Elena pushed open the heavy side door. The air inside was stiflingly hot and smelled intensely of vulcanized rubber and stale sweat. High above, industrial ventilation fans churned slowly, slicing through shafts of dust-moted light that fell from the skylights. She walked onto the main mat, her footsteps absorbed by the thick black padding. The space was vast, designed for violent movement, and standing in the center of it were the 4 recruits. They had stripped off their tactical vests and shirts, wearing only their green cargo trousers and boots, their torsos glistening with the sheen of exertion. They looked like statues carved from granite, young, powerful, and brimming with potential energy. Caleb Miller sat on a stack of tires, tossing a roll of duct tape hand to hand. When he saw Elena, he stood up slowly, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You actually came," Miller said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "I owe O'Connor $20. He thought you'd run to the base commander." Elena stopped 10 paces from them. She did not assume a defensive posture. She stood with her feet shoulder-width apart, her hands relaxed at her sides, holding the ubiquitous clipboard. To the untrained eye, she looked hopelessly outmatched, a small logistics officer standing before 4 giants. "I am here to inspect the condition of the mats for tomorrow's evolution," Elena lied smoothly, her tone conversational, "and to see if you are ready to fulfill your duty on the range." Miller laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He walked toward her, his friends fanning out to flank him, cutting off her direct path to the exit. It was a classic intimidation tactic: encircle and overwhelm. "Cut the act, Viper," Miller said, using the nickname he had heard the officers whisper, twisting it into an insult. "We're here to settle this. You think you can order us around because you wear a collar device? Out here, rank doesn't matter. Only performance matters." He stopped 3 feet from her. He was close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his neck. "Here's the deal," Miller continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We wrestle. Light contact. If you can stay on your feet, or even just stay conscious, for 60 seconds against us, we'll go back and scrub that range until it shines. We'll even polish your boots." He paused, leaning in closer. "But when you quit, or when you start crying, you leave us alone. You stop pretending you're one of us." Elena looked at the 4 men. She analyzed their stances. Miller was heavy on his front foot, aggressive but unbalanced. The man to his right, O'Connor, kept his hands low, leaving his head exposed. They were strong, undoubtedly. They were fit, but they were looking at her as a woman, not as a threat. That was their first, and likely fatal, mistake. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. It was the switch. The psychological mechanism she had developed over a decade of black operations. The world slowed down. Colors became sharper. Sounds became distinct frequencies. The logistics officer was receding. The operator was stepping forward. 60 seconds, Elena repeated, her voice devoid of emotion. 1 minute, Miller confirmed, checking the expensive tactical watch on his wrist. Clock starts when you... Elena interrupted him by calmly placing her clipboard on a nearby equipment crate. She reached up and unbuttoned her cuffs, rolling them up slowly to reveal forearms that were wiry and scarred. Then she unclasped her own watch, a battered, nondescript digital piece, and set it gently top of the clipboard. She turned back to face them. Her stance shifted imperceptibly. Her center of gravity dropped. Her hands came up, not in fists, but open, relaxed, like a surgeon preparing to cut. "I won't need a minute," Elena said softly. "And neither will you." The air in the room seemed to drop in temperature. Miller frowned, confused by her sudden change in demeanor. He had expected fear. Instead, he was looking at something he couldn't quite identify, something ancient and dangerous. "Get her," Miller ordered, waving a hand at the recruit on his left. The game was over. The lesson had begun. The command hung in the air, simple and dismissive. Get her. It was the kind of order one gave to a dog to chase a squirrel. The recruit on Miller's left, a broad-shouldered young man named Jenkins who had been smirking since they entered the building, stepped forward. He didn't raise his hands in a guard. He didn't tuck his chin. He walked toward Elena with a loose, loping stride, his arms hanging open, as if he intended to wrap her in a bear hug and lift her off the ground like a child. "Easy, Chief," Jenkins said, chuckling as he closed the distance. "Don't struggle, and we won't have to drop you too hard." Elena watched him come. In the span of 3 seconds, her mind engaged a protocol that had been dormant for months. It was a shedding of skin, the paperwork, the inventory lists, the dull ache of rehabilitation, all of it evaporated. The world narrowed down to vectors, velocity, and leverage. To the recruits, she appeared frozen. Her arms were down, her posture seemingly casual. They mistook her stillness for paralysis. They did not recognize the open guard stance of a practitioner who baited opponents into entering their striking range. They did not see that her weight was perfectly distributed on the balls of her feet, ready to explode in any direction. Jenkins reached out. His hand was aimed at her shoulder, his fingers spread wide. It was a lazy, arrogant grab. Mistake one, Elena thought. Overconfidence. She did not retreat. As his hand came within inches of her uniform, Elena exhaled, a sharp, almost silent release of breath. She stepped into his space, not away from it. The movement was so sudden that Jenkins blinked, his brain failing to process the change in distance. Before his fingers could close on fabric, Elena's left hand shot up, not to block, but to guide. She caught his wrist, her grip like a vice, and simultaneously pivoted her hips. It was not a contest of strength. It was simple physics. She applied a rotational torque to his extended arm while stepping past his right leg. Jenkins's forward momentum, combined with her redirection, turned his own body weight against him. There was no struggle. There was only a blur of motion and the sickening sound of equilibrium being stolen. Slam. The sound of a 200-pound body hitting the rubber mat echoed like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Jenkins hit the floor flat, on his back, the wind driven from his lungs in a guttural whoosh. The impact was controlled but violent enough to rattle his teeth. Elena stood over him, still holding his wrist for a fraction of a second to ensure he stayed down, before releasing it with a dismissive flick. She hadn't even broken a sweat. She looked up, her expression unchanged, her breathing rhythmic and slow. The laughter in the room died instantly. Miller, who had been leaning back against a support beam with his arms crossed, straightened up as if he had been electrocuted. The other two recruits, O'Connor and the fourth man, froze in place, their smiles replaced by slack-jawed confusion. Their brains were struggling to reconcile the data. The small logistics lady had just flattened their second strongest man in under 2 seconds. "He was off balance," O'Connor muttered, his voice sounding thin in the silence. "She just tripped him." "Get up, Jenkins," Miller barked, his face flushing with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Jenkins groaned on the floor, rolling onto his side and clutching his ribs. He wasn't injured, just stunned, his ego bruised far worse than his torso. He looked up at Elena with wide, fearful eyes, realizing too late that the woman standing above him was not who they thought she was. Elena turned her gaze to the remaining three. She didn't speak. She didn't taunt them. She simply raised her hands to chest level, palms facing outward, fingers curled slightly. It was an invitation. Mistake two, she thought, watching Miller's eyes narrow into slits of rage. Emotional compromise. They weren't laughing anymore. Good. Now, they were ready to learn. The shock of seeing Jenkins hit the floor lasted exactly 3 seconds. It evaporated the moment Caleb Miller's initial confusion hardened into fury. To him, this was no longer a sparring match. It was a humiliating rebellion that had to be crushed. "Don't just stand there," Miller roared, his voice cracking with intensity. "Get her, both of you, now!" O'Connor and the fourth recruit, a stocky man named Harris, exchanged a brief glance. The hesitation was gone, replaced by the instinctual drive to protect the pack. They moved simultaneously, correcting the mistake Jenkins had made. They didn't come in one at a time. They fanned out, creating a pincer movement designed to cut off Elena's escape routes and crush her between their combined 400 pounds of mass. Elena watched the geometry of the attack form. In the chaotic blur of combat, most people saw faces and fists. Elena saw lines of force and centers of gravity. O'Connor was faster, coming in from the left with a high guard. Harris was coming low from the right, looking for a tackle to take her legs out. 2 targets. 1 second. Mobility is survivability. She did not back up. Retreating would only allow them to synchronize their arrival. Instead, she exploded forward, diving straight into the gap that was closing between them. It was a counterintuitive move that caught them off guard. O'Connor reacted first, throwing a clumsy haymaker aimed at her head. It was a brawl punch, powerful but telegraphed. Elena didn't block it. Blocking a strike from a man twice her size would only result in a broken forearm. Instead, she ducked under the arc of his arm, moving inside his guard. As she passed under him, her hand snaked out, capturing his extended wrist, while her other hand clamped onto his elbow. With a sharp, precise pivot of her hips, she didn't just dodge him, she redirected him. She pulled O'Connor across her body, accelerating his own forward momentum. Harris, the tackler, was just committing to his lunge. He looked up just in time to see O'Connor's body flying toward him. There was a sickening crunch of bone meeting bone as O'Connor collided with Harris. The impact was brutal. The two men tangled in a confusion of limbs and curses. Harris, struck in the chest by his teammate, staggered back, gasping for air. O'Connor, off balance and disoriented, flailed to stay upright. Elena did not pause to admire her work. She spun behind the stumbling O'Connor. She kicked the back of his knee, a surgical strike to the peroneal nerve. O'Connor's leg buckled instantly, and he collapsed to the mat with a cry of pain. Harris was still standing, though winded. He shook off the collision and turned toward her, his face red with exertion. He roared, abandoning all technique, and charged like a bull. Elena waited. She stood perfectly still until he was within arm's reach. As he reached out to grab her vest, she stepped offline, a movement as fluid as water flowing around a rock. She caught his outstretched arm, trapping it against her chest, and applied pressure to the elbow joint against its natural range of motion. It wasn't a break. She wasn't trying to cripple him permanently, but it was a hyperextension that sent a bolt of blinding agony straight to his brain. "Down," she whispered. She dropped her weight. Harris followed, forced to the ground by the leverage on his arm. He slammed face first into the rubber mat, tapping frantically with his free hand. Elena released him and stepped back in one smooth motion. The room fell into a heavy, panting silence. 3 men were down. Jenkins was nursing his back. O'Connor was clutching his leg. Harris was curled in a fetal position, holding his elbow. 40 seconds had passed since Miller had looked at his watch. Elena smoothed the front of her uniform. Her breathing was slightly elevated, but controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth. She turned slowly to face the only man left standing. Caleb Miller was alone. The wall of muscle he hid behind was gone. The audience he performed for was incapacitated. Now, there was nothing between him and the logistics clerk but 10 feet of empty air and the sudden, terrifying realization that he was the next item on the checklist. Caleb Miller was no longer a recruit in that moment, stripped of his bravado and his pack. He was an animal cornered by a predator he did not understand. The humiliating defeat of his 3 subordinates had stripped away the veneer of the disciplined sailor, leaving only the raw, violent instinct of a street fighter. He didn't rush in blindly like Harris. Miller had trained in mixed martial arts before enlistment. He knew spacing. He knew timing. He circled Elena, his hands raised in a tight boxing guard, his eyes darting, looking for a weakness in her defense. There was none. She simply tracked him, her body rotating on an axis, her expression as unreadable as stone. "You think you're fast?" Miller spat, feinting a jab to test her reaction. Elena didn't bite. She didn't flinch. She knew the range of a standard jab down to the millimeter. He was 2 inches out of striking distance. "I think you are wasting oxygen, recruit," she replied calmly. With a roar of frustration, Miller committed. He launched a vicious 1-2 combination. A stiff jab followed by a looping overhand right intended to take her head off. The power behind the punch was enough to crack a jaw or shatter an orbital bone. Elena slipped the jab with a subtle tilt of her head. As the heavy right hand came thundering toward her, she didn't retreat. She stepped inside the arc of the punch, moving into the eye of the storm where the velocity was 0. Her body collided with his torso, not with a thud, but with a seamless integration of mass. Before Miller could retract his arm, Elena wrapped her right arm around his waist and hooked her left leg behind his right knee. It was a textbook Osoto Gari, a major outer reap, executed with the precision of a master. She reaped his leg while driving her shoulder into his chest. Gravity did the rest. Miller's feet left the earth. For a heartbeat, he was weightless, staring up at the dusty skylights. Then the world slammed into his back. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a sharp, agonizing gasp. He tried to scramble, to use his superior strength to bench press her off him, but Elena was already moving. She spun to his back, her movements fluid and inescapable like water filling a void. Miller rolled to his knees, trying to stand, but that was exactly what she wanted. As he rose, she slid her arms around his neck. The V of her right elbow caught his trachea perfectly. Her left hand grabbed her right bicep, locking the choke in place, and she placed her left hand behind his head to apply forward pressure. The rear naked choke. The lion killer. "Don't fight it," Elena whispered into his ear. Her voice was terrifyingly gentle. "It only gets tighter." Miller panicked. He thrashed, clawing at her arms, his fingernails digging into her uniform. He tried to throw himself backward to slam her, but she hooked her legs around his waist. flattening him out, anchoring herself to him like a burr. She squeezed, not with a jerky motion, but with a slow hydraulic constriction. She cut off the blood flow through the carotid arteries. The world began to tunnel for Miller. The sounds of the gym, the hum of the fans, the distant ocean faded into a high-pitched whine. His vision blurred at the edges, turning gray, then black. The panic turned to terror, and then, inevitably, to a sluggish, heavy acceptance. His thrashing slowed. His arms fell limp to the mat. Elena held the choke for 1 second longer, just enough to let him taste the void, then loosened her grip slightly. She didn't let go. She kept him pinned, her arm still coiled around his neck like a viper, ready to strike again if he twitched. She looked up. The other 3 recruits, Jenkins, O'Connor, and Harris, were scrambling to their feet, nursing their injuries. They stared at the scene before them, with eyes wide as saucers. Their leader, the invincible Miller, was face down in the dirt, dominated by a woman half his size. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They barely breathed. They were frozen in a tableau of absolute shock. 40 seconds, Elena said, her voice cutting through the silence, echoing the words she would speak in the recurring nightmare of their memories for years to come. That is how long it takes for a lack of oxygen to turn panic into unconsciousness. She looked at the boys, then down at the man in her arms. "Class is in session," she said. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the realization that the hierarchy of their world had just been violently and permanently inverted. Elena released the pressure on Miller's neck. The recruit gasped, a ragged, desperate sound like a drowning man breaking the surface. He rolled onto his side, coughing violently, clutching his throat as the blood rushed back into his head. The color returned to his face, but the arrogance did not. It had been left somewhere in the darkness of the chokehold. Elena stood up. She took a step back, creating space not out of fear, but out of command presence. She looked at the other 3 men. Jenkins, O'Connor, and Harris were still standing by the wall, their postures slumped, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. They looked like children who had broken a priceless vase and were waiting for the inevitable punishment. The silence in the training shed was absolute. The industrial fans seemed to hum louder, underscoring the lack of human noise. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Elena reached up to her collar. The scuffle had disarranged her uniform, pulling the fabric askew. With slow, deliberate movements, she smoothed the beige blouse. Her hand lingered for a moment on the top button. Then she adjusted the neckline. As the fabric shifted, a shaft of sunlight from the skylight caught something pinned to her undershirt, something that had been hidden beneath the high collar of her utility uniform. It was a dull, oxidized gold insignia, an eagle, a pistol, a trident. Also visible, tracing a jagged line from her collarbone up toward her neck, was the shiny, puckered tissue of an old bullet wound, a souvenir from a rooftop in Kandahar that no training manual could replicate. Miller, still on his knees, looked up, his eyes locked onto the metal. The trident, the symbol of the Navy SEALs, the badge of the elite, the Budweiser that every man in that room was killing himself to earn, yet none of them possessed. And above it, the collar device she had pulled from her pocket and pinned back on, the single star and 3 chevrons of a Master Chief Petty Officer, an E9, the highest enlisted rank in the Navy, a god among sailors. The realization hit Miller like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He wasn't just beaten by a woman. He had assaulted a Master Chief. He had challenged a Tier 1 operator. He had mocked a legend. "You," Miller wheezed, his voice trembling. "I am the logistics officer," Elena said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a sledgehammer. "I am also Master Chief Vance, but to the enemies of this country, I am simply the last thing they never see coming." She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze lingering long enough to peel back their souls. "You judged me by my size," she continued. "You judged me by my gender. You judged me by my job title. And because of that judgment, you are all dead. If this were a real operation, your throats would be cut, your intel compromised, and your mission failed, because you were too busy stroking your egos to recognize a threat." O'Connor looked down at his boots, shame burning his ears crimson. Harris swallowed hard, looking like he might be sick. "The enemy does not care how much you can bench press," Elena said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The enemy does not care about your bravado. The only thing that matters is capability. And right now, gentlemen, you have none." She pointed a finger at the ground. "Stand up." It was not a request. It was a command that bypassed their conscious brains and wired directly into their muscle memory. All four men scrambled to their feet. They snapped to attention, their heels locking together, their backs straight, ignoring the pain in their bruised ribs and twisted joints. They stood in a perfect line, eyes fixed forward, afraid to even blink. Elena walked down the line, inspecting them. She stopped in front of Miller. He was taller than her, broad and powerful, but in that moment, he looked small. He couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the wall, a single tear of humiliation tracking through the dust on his cheek. "You wanted to know about pain, Recruit Miller," Elena said softly. "You wanted a lesson. Is class dismissed? Or do you require further instruction?" "No, Master Chief," Miller shouted, his voice cracking. "No further instruction, Master Chief." "Good," Elena said. She checked her watch. "Because you still have a range to clean." The dust in the training shed began to settle, drifting in the shafts of light like microscopic debris from a collapsed building. Miller, Jenkins, O'Connor, and Harris stood rigid, their chests heaving, waiting for the axe to fall. In the Navy, striking a superior officer was not a minor infraction. It was a court-martial offense. It meant a dishonorable discharge and a permanent stain on their records. They knew this. They could practically hear the sound of their dreams shattering. Elena picked up her clipboard from the crate where she had left it. She retrieved her watch, fastening it back onto her wrist with methodical slowness. Every click of the clasp sounded like a judge's gavel in the silent room. "You are waiting for me to file a report," Elena stated, not asking. She didn't look up from her wrist. "Yes, Master Chief," Miller whispered, his voice hoarse. He was staring at the wall, unable to process the magnitude of his mistake. The shame was a physical heat radiating from his skin. Elena walked closer to him. She stopped so that she was directly in his peripheral vision. "A report would end you," she said softly. "You would be out of the Navy by sunset. You would go home, tell your families you failed, and spend the rest of your lives wondering why you couldn't keep your mouths shut." She paused, letting the reality sink in. "But I am not going to file a report." Miller's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with shock. "Master Chief?" "Because if I file a report," Elena continued, her voice hardening, "I am admitting that 4 unbloodied children managed to get under my skin. And you didn't. You are not important enough to ruin my afternoon with paperwork." She stepped back, addressing the whole group. Her demeanor shifted from the combatant back to the instructor, cold, distant, and exacting. The ethos of this community is not about who is the loudest. It is not about who has the biggest muscles or who can talk the most trash in the chow hall. It is about being a quiet professional. It is about doing the work in the dark when no one is watching. It is about humility. She pointed a finger at Miller's chest. "You are loud, Miller. You are bright. You are a target. If you had walked onto a battlefield today with that attitude, you wouldn't just be dead. You would have gotten your whole platoon killed. That is the sin I cannot forgive." Miller swallowed hard. The truth of her words cut deeper than any physical blow. He realized now that his arrogance hadn't just been annoying. It had been a tactical liability. "I am giving you a choice," Elena said. "You can walk out that door, ring the bell, and quit right now. Save us the trouble." Silence stretched. "Or," she continued, "you can earn your way back, but the price is high." "Anything," Miller blurted out. "We'll do anything, Master Chief." Elena smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a drill instructor who knew exactly how much the human body could suffer. "The beach," she said, pointing toward the ocean. 10 miles. Soft. Sand. Boots and trousers only. And I want you to carry a log, not a small one. The big oak log from the pile." A groan threatened to escape Jenkins's lips, but he stifled it. 10 miles in soft sand with a log was brutal punishment for a fresh squad, let alone one that had just been physically dismantled. "And while you run," Elena added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I want you to think about every word you said to me. I want you to think about the logistics, lady. I want you to think about what it actually means to serve." "Yes, Master Chief," they shouted in unison, a desperate gratitude coloring their voices. They were being punished, yes, but they were being allowed to stay. They were being given a lifeline. "Get out of my sight," Elena ordered. "And if I see a single speck of brass on that range when I inspect it tomorrow, you will be running until your legs fall off." "Hoo-yah, Master Chief!" They scrambled for the door, moving with a frantic urgency they had never shown before. They didn't look back. They didn't joke. They ran toward the log pile like men escaping a burning building. Elena watched them go. She stood alone in the center of the mat, the silence returning to the room. She felt the ache in her shoulder flare up again, a dull reminder of her own mortality. She rubbed the spot absently. She had broken them down. Now, maybe, just maybe, the instructors could build them into something useful. The walk back to the logistics support unit building felt longer than the run to the training shed. The adrenaline that had flooded Elena's system was receding, leaving behind the familiar, throbbing ache in her left shoulder and a profound sense of fatigue. It was the crash that always followed combat, even combat as controlled and brief as what had just occurred. She entered the cool, fluorescent-lit sanctuary of her office. The stack of requisition forms for the mess hall was exactly where she had left it. The digital clock on the wall blinked methodically. To the rest of the base, she had been gone for less than 20 minutes. In that time, she had dismantled the ego of an entire boat crew. The phone on her desk rang. It was a single, sharp trill that sounded disproportionately loud in the quiet room. Elena stared at it for a moment, before lifting the receiver. "Logistics," Vance speaking. "Master Chief," a male voice said on the other end. It was the executive officer's adjutant. "Captain Thorne requests your presence in his office. Immediately." "Understood," Elena replied. She hung up gently. Captain Thorne was the commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Center. He was an old sea dog, a man who had earned his trident when the equipment was made of canvas and the maps were made of paper. He did not call logistics personnel to his office for inventory updates. He called them when there was a problem. Elena adjusted her uniform in the reflection of the window, ensuring her collar device was once again hidden, though she suspected the secret was already out. She walked to the administration building, her face composing itself into a mask of professional neutrality. When she entered the captain's office, Thorne was standing by the window, his back to the door. On his desk, a computer monitor was angled slightly outward. On the screen, a frozen black and white image from a security camera showed a bird's-eye view of Training Ground 4. It showed Elena standing over 4 prone bodies. "Close the door, Master Chief," Thorne said without turning around. Elena closed the heavy oak door. "Sir." Thorne turned. He was a man carved from granite, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. He gestured toward the screen. "I had a safety officer call me," Thorne said, his voice gravelly. "He thought we had a hazing incident in progress. Imagine my surprise when I pulled up the feed and saw my lead logistics officer conducting an unauthorized clinic in close-quarters combat." Elena stood at attention. "It was a corrective measure, sir. The recruits were misguided regarding the value of support personnel. I felt a practical demonstration was required to realign their priorities." Thorne looked at her, then back at the screen. A ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth, quickly suppressed. "You took a risk, Elena," he said, using her first name, dropping the formality for a brief second. "If one of those boys had been seriously injured, I would have had to hang you out to dry. Politics these days don't favor the old ways of teaching." "I know the anatomy of the human body, sir," Elena replied calmly. "I applied exactly enough pressure to educate, not to damage. They will be sore, but they will be functional." Thorne walked over to a side table where a pot of coffee was brewing. The smell was rich and dark. He poured 2 mugs. "Miller is a good kid," Thorne said, handing her one of the mugs. "But he's arrogant. He thinks the trident makes him a god. We've been trying to break that out of him for weeks. The instructors yell, they smoke him, they make him do push-ups. But he feeds on that. He thinks it proves he's tough." He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim of the mug. "But being beaten by a supply clerk?" Thorne chuckled softly. "That hits him somewhere the push-ups can't reach. You didn't just beat him, Master Chief. You deconstructed him." Elena took the cup. The ceramic was warm against her palms. "They needed to understand that the uniform doesn't make the soldier, sir. The man makes the uniform, or in this case, the woman." "Indeed." Thorne moved back to the window. "Come look at this." Elena stepped up beside him. From the second-story view, they could see the long stretch of the Silver Strand beach. In the distance, 4 small figures were moving slowly against the crashing waves. They were carrying a massive log on their shoulders, their feet sinking deep into the soft sand. They were not running as individuals anymore. They were moving in sync. When one stumbled, the others slowed to catch the weight. They were suffering, but they were suffering together. "I haven't seen Miller check his watch once," Thorne observed, "and I haven't seen him leave a man behind." "He learned," Elena said simply. "Thank you, Master Chief," Thorne said, clinking his mug gently against hers. "Carry on." "Aye, sir." Elena finished her coffee, the bitter taste grounding her. She set the mug down and turned to leave. She was still just a logistics officer to the rest of the world. But in this office, and on that beach, the truth was known. And that was enough. 6 weeks later, the morning fog clung to the coastline of Coronado like a heavy, wet blanket. It was a typical June gloom in Southern California. She watched the ceremony from a distance. The candidates marched out, no longer ragged recruits covered in sand and misery. They were sailors in pristine dress whites, their movements sharp and synchronized. Only 24 men remained of the original 150. They were the survivors. And now, the voice of Captain Thorne boomed over the loudspeakers. The award for the honor man of Class 356. The candidate who best exemplifies the Navy Corps values of honor, courage, and commitment. Elena watched as a tall figure stepped forward from the ranks. Caleb Miller. He looked different. The physical bulk was still there, but the posture had changed. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded solidity. His uniform was immaculate, his gaze steady. Technically, it was a breach of protocol to salute a civilian in the middle of a ceremony. But they both knew he wasn't saluting a civilian. He wasn't even saluting a Master Chief. He was saluting the teacher who had broken him down so he could be rebuilt correctly. He was acknowledging that the trident he would soon pin on his chest was earned not just on the beach, but on the rubber mats of Training Ground 4. Elena felt a tightness in her throat. She didn't return the salute. That would draw attention. She simply offered a single, slow nod. Message received. Mission accomplished. Miller held the gaze for a second longer, then dropped his hand and marched back to his line, his eyes focused forward on the future. Elena picked up her bag. The weight felt familiar and comforting. She turned away from the ceremony, walking toward the waiting car that would take her to the airfield. As she passed the logistics warehouse one last time, she heard two young ensigns talking near the door. "Hey, did you hear about the new supply guy coming in?" one asked. "Yeah," the other replied. "Hopefully he's easier to deal with than the last one. I heard she was terrifying. Some of the recruits say she was a ghost." Elena smiled, a faint, fleeting expression that didn't reach her eyes. She kept walking, her footsteps silent on the pavement. The legend of the logistics lady would grow with every retelling, becoming a myth to scare the arrogance out of future classes. That was fine. She didn't need the credit. She didn't need the fame. She was Viper, and she had work to do in the shadows.